Live truth, speak truth. This is the Jacob Kersey Program.
Welcome to the Jacob Kersey Program at Real Jacob Kersey in the world of social media. If you want to connect with us there, thank you to all who leave a rating and review. It really does help us fight the algorithm police. In fact, I have been shadow banned on Facebook. So while some people can still see my content, most of the people that follow me never see the content on there on Facebook, even though Facebook says I'm no longer restricted. So thank you to all who do leave a rating and review. It helps us fight terrible woke algorithms just like that, and the woke mob who try to silence Christians, who try to silence conservative voices. So thank you so much for doing that. I am stoked about this episode here. Those of you who know me well know that I am a history buff. I love history. Ultimately, all of history is God's story. And you learn so much from history. You see that a lot of the questions and circumstances and situations that we encounter in our lives today during our generation, past generations have experienced those same types of questions as well. And what you see is you see the right way to respond, you see the wrong way to respond, and you see how these circumstances really shape the people, shape the leaders, shape the thinkers, shape the philosophers, shape the pastors, the preachers, the theologians, and yes, even the dictators. Gives you perspective. And so I love history. In this episode, we're going to be talking about three historical figures, three figures of whom I admire and I love to learn about, and I'm excited to talk to someone who is an expert on these three individuals. Starting off, I'm just going to tell you that the 17th century philosopher John Locke, we're going to be talking about him. His political theory had a substantial impact on America's founding and Western thought. He has been called one of the most influential thinkers of the Enlightenment. But what ideas exactly did Locke champion that became part of the skeletal structure, so to speak, of the United States Declaration of Independence? We're going to be talking about that. And in addition to that discussion, we're going to fast forward to the 20th century and visit a God-ordained friendship between two of the greatest authors this world has ever known, Clive Staples Lewis and John Ronald Reuel Tolkien. I'm so excited to have this conversation about these three men. Well, joining me to talk about this is Joseph Loconte, Dr. Joseph Loconte. He is a senior fellow with the Institute on Religion and Democracy and the author of A Hobbit, A Wardrobe, and a Great War, How J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis Rediscovered Faith, Friendship, and Heroism in the Cataclysm of 1914 through 1918. And he is also a John Locke scholar and the author of God, Locke, and Liberty, The Struggle for Religious Freedom in the West. And that is what we're going to start with here at the beginning. Dr. Loconte, thank you so much for being willing to join us here on the podcast.
Thank you, Jacob, so much for having me. Good to be with you.
Yeah, so you are the author of this latter book that I mentioned, God, Locke, and Liberty, where you talk about John Locke and his treatise that he wrote there at the end of the 17th century that has been championed for religious freedom. What led you to write a book specifically about John Locke, and what did you discover about his philosophy in your time doing that?
Yeah, thanks for those questions, Jacob. I appreciate it. Well, the Locke book really grew out of my dissertation work for my PhD at the King's College London, University of London. And I became fascinated with Locke initially because of his transformative defense of religious freedom. His letter concerning toleration, which was published in 1685. And I think that argument for freedom of conscience, it set the template. It was the document you had to read, beginning really in the 1680s, right through the American Revolution. It was the document you had to read if you wanted to make a defense for religious liberty in the way that he argued, and we can get into that. So that's one of his contributions, is making such a distinctive signal contribution to the debates about freedom of conscience. But the other thing, of course, that the American founders, it was not only Locke's defense of religious freedom that they cared about. It was, of course, his two treatises of government, particularly the second treatise. And it's in the second treatise where Locke makes a moral argument and even a religiously rooted argument for natural rights, for government that is based on the consent of the governed, a government that protects those natural rights. And here's the key thing for the founders, the right to revolt against the government if it tramples those natural rights. So the second treatise was really the revolutionary document that the founders had in their hip pockets. As they're mapping out the revolution, Locke was a huge source of inspiration, a moral grounding for the right to political revolution.
And our founders certainly were well-read men. They were well-learned men. They took from philosophers, thinkers like Locke, and you can really see some of those ideas that he espoused and he talked about in his writings flow over into the American Revolution. But Locke himself was influenced by the days in which he lived. He lived in the 17th century. He was born in 1632. How did the events of 17th century Europe, like the English Civil War, like the religious persecution, such as that by the French Huguenots, which was, he fled to Holland, and a lot of the French Huguenots fled to Holland as well. How did those events shape him?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think sometimes political scientists and or others, they lift Locke out of his historical context. That's happening right now in some of our political debates. The people who, unfortunately, conservatives who are rejecting Locke and his principles, I think they've completely stripped him out of his historical context. Remember, there are two great ideological sort of problems or political problems in 17th century Europe, particularly in England. And the two great challenges to human freedom are, number one, there's political authoritarianism. The idea that a government, a regime, is going to erode your natural rights, trample your natural rights in the pursuit of the will to power. So political absolutism would be the short way to put it. That's what Locke lived through as not just as a young man, but really throughout his life in the 17th centuries. The English Civil War in the 1640s and 50s was a struggle between the king, who's trying to exert absolute power, Charles I, against the parliament. And that just becomes a bloody mess. And we can get into that. But political absolutism as it expressed itself in Great Britain, but then also right across the English Channel in France. Because what did you have in France? Louis XIV, who called himself the Sun King. This is absolute monarchy on steroids with Louis XIV. So he's surrounded by that. He sees political absolutism as kind of an emerging model in Europe, the kind of thing that Thomas Hobbes would support. And he's pushing back against that. That's the one big ideological threat. The second, I'll just mention briefly, not only political absolutism, but religious absolutism. Because in the 17th century Europe, church and state are basically bound at the hip. And so you have a religious justification, divine right of kings, for political absolutism. So you have, whether it's in a Protestant sense, the Anglican Church acting in an absolutist way, an intolerant way, or the Catholic Church in France acting in an extremely intolerant way. Locke is facing both of those political problems, those cultural challenges, political absolutism and religious absolutism. And this is why I think he's a magnificent thinker, because in works like The Letter Concerning Toleration and the Second Treatise, he's taking on both of these challenges. And I think those were both transformative documents, and they became really the political canon, part of the political canon for Western liberal democracy.
You talk about Locke responding to the political absolutism of his day and the religious absolutism of his day, and I think our founders very similarly had that experience. Obviously, looking back at American history, many of the groups that fled from Europe to America to establish colonies were fleeing religious persecution, and then they themselves engaged in it. And so I think our founders were learning from those lessons, but also dealing with the political absolutism of Parliament and King George III. So obviously you see a major parallel between what our founders were dealing with and what Locke dealt with a century before.
Yes, that's an excellent point, Jacob. I mean, it's 100 years later. Think about it. Locke writes his Letter on Toleration. It's published in 1689. think about it, 100 years later, almost to the day, 1787, the Philadelphia Convention. And what are the founders laying out? They're laying out a constitution. It is a constitution rooted in natural law and natural rights. A Bill of Rights is what's going to be added to it. And if you think about it, the principles that Locke lays out in his 2 treatises of government, the letter concerning toleration, he is laying the groundwork for our constitutional order. It takes 100 years later. Locke is actually arguing for something like the separation of church and state back in 1689. But it's going to take the Americans to grab onto those Lockean ideas and institutionalize them for the first time. That's part of the radical nature of the American Revolution and the Constitutional Convention. Because like no other government had ever attempted, no other political entity had ever attempted, the Americans are saying, wait a minute, we're not going to have a national church. We're going to protect the rights of conscience, freedom of conscience. So there'll be no national church, national religion. We will institutionally separate church and state. They're not separating faith from life. That's the mistake the hard left makes. But they are separating institutionally the arm of government, the coercive arm of government, from the church, from religious institutions, because they know how important freedom of conscience is for civil society and for producing civic virtue.
You talk about just kind of the left's misunderstanding of separation of church and state. I think that's so interesting. Recently we had Howard Goldthwait of First Liberty Institute out in Plano, Texas, join the show and talk about that. And he pointed out that our founders' original vision of separation of church and state is that the wall that so many conceive of is supposed to be placed around the government and not the church. And yet it's just the opposite. Many people think today what our founders meant is that the walls are placed around churches to where you practice your faith at home, you practice it on Sunday morning, and then after that you can't practice your faith. And so the wall, and many like the hard left, their mind is the wall should be around the church. And I don't think that's what Locke thought, and I don't think that's what our founders thought either.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right, Jacob. Let me just fill it out just a little bit. Locke was certainly aware of and a victim of, and he saw plenty of victims of religious sectarianism, militant religion. So he was very aware that religion could go off the rails. In the name of Christianity, all kinds of wretched things were done in the 17th century. If you didn't belong to the Church of England and refused to worship in the Church of England, you faced civil criminal penalties. And if you were not a Catholic, if you dissented from the Catholic Church in France, as you mentioned, there was a wave of persecution launched by Louis XIV, approved by the Pope, which sent hundreds of thousands of Protestants fleeing France into Holland, into America and other places. So Locke was not ignorant of the flame of sectarian religion and damage it can do, but that wasn't his main concern at the end of the day. What he was after, and what the founders picked up on in a beautiful way, was this. He wanted every political government, every political authority, to treat with equal justice people of all faiths. The principle of equal justice under the law, no favoritism toward religious groups. If you could establish a political government, a political society along those lines, Locke reasons, then you'll have everyone buying into that political system, into that nation state, because they'll have an equal stake in its success. Treat people equally, and they will not be resorting to force of arms. That's the brilliant argument of John Locke, and the founders pick up on this beautifully. If you read Madison's Memorial and Remonstrance, this is when they're having a debate in Virginia in the 1780s. And we've got some characters there in Virginia, Patrick Henry among them, who want to level a tax in Virginia to support, quote unquote, all of the churches in Virginia, which really meant the Anglican Church. Prop up the Anglican Church, we're going to levy a tax. Madison and Jefferson say, no, this is the slippery slope to tyranny, to political tyranny, and to religious tyranny. And they oppose it. And Madison writes this brilliant tract, echoing John Locke in so many places, the rights of conscience. You can't use government to prop up your preferred religion. And that is an insight, I think, that lies near the heart of the genius of the American experiment. No thinker, I should just mention, no writer over the last, I think, 30 years in America who has been better on this than my good friend Os Guinness. He's written a number of books along these lines. He has another book out recently also along these lines. Part of the genius of the American experiment is to understand, we don't need a wall around religion. We need to protect people of faith, of all faiths, and people of no faith from the coercive arm of the state. That's the great danger in the 21st century.
Yeah, so if our founders so masterfully created this government that did just that, what you just said that we need, they put a wall around the government to keep it from telling people what they could believe in spiritually, to keep preachers from preaching what they believe they were called to preach. If the wall is supposed to be around that government, and our founders did such a great job responding to those challenges that we see in Europe, how is it that Americans have gone so far to now the hard left was able to stoke that fear and say, well, America's original vision wasn't to put the wall around the government, when that's exactly what our founders did? Why are we so far from that, and now everyone's afraid of religion and not the government?
That's a terrific question, and it is not. And it's I'm out of my depth trying to answer it, Jacob, because it involves probably so many factors. Not just, I'm an intellectual historian, so it certainly involves the history of ideas, but it also involves other things too. Institutions, social forces, demographics, all kinds of things. But let's try to think about this for a minute. When you think about whether it's in politics or in education in particular, one of the huge sea changes in our educational system over the last 100 years has been a growing skepticism about religious belief as a force for good, not only in the truth value of Christianity or Judaism, not only that these religious faiths have nothing to tell us about facts or the world we live in. that began to happen in the 19th century after Darwin. Religion can't tell us anything about the real world. So we began to see that certainly in the 19th century, but then a growing suspicion and rejection of religious institutions and religious beliefs as somehow an opponent of human dignity and human freedom. You certainly saw this in the French Revolution. Unlike the American Revolution, the French and the French Enlightenment, which was pretty secular. It was deeply anti-religious, not just anti-Catholic, but anti-Christian. The French Revolution, unlike the American Revolution, where the faith and freedom really went arm in arm in the American Revolution, but not in the French Revolution. And here's maybe a partial answer to your question. And Os Guinness is also very good on this question. We are in a phase right now, I think, in American society where we're trying to decide, all right, are we the heirs of the French Revolution, or are we the heirs of the American Revolution? Meaning, do we really follow the French militantly secular line that religion has to be contained, constrained, quarantined, or it's going to be a threat to human liberty? Is that where we are? That's the French model. Or is it the American model where religious freedom leads to human flourishing, properly understood, because it's such a force for good, a source for moral formation, the support of families, enriching communities, the activity coming out of churches, synagogues, and mosques historically has been such a great source of civic life and civic vitality in America. So we got to decide, are we the children of the French Enlightenment and the French Revolution, or the American Enlightenment and the American Revolution properly understood? I think we're having a huge cultural debate about that right now.
I think you make an excellent point. Back in Georgia, where I'm originally from, currently up in Washington, D.C., but back in Georgia, I spent about 3 years working in the historic sites there and teaching the local history, mainly military history. And one of the individuals that actually had a supervisor role there would say sometimes at the end of the programs, the educational programs we would deliver, if we don't know where we're coming from, talking about our history, how will we ever know where we're going? And what you just said there, this identity crisis, not knowing that we're actually sons and daughters of the American Revolution. So
Yes.
many think that the American Revolution was just like the French Revolution. You talk,
Yes.
I see so many on the left who think that the founding fathers were anti-Christian religion, that they were all a bunch of deists, and you mentioned earlier, talking about Locke. You talked about the danger of stripping historical figures out of the context of their day.
Yes. That's right.
And taking them out of context, cherry picking what they say. But when you look at them
That's
as a
right.
whole, they were religious individuals. They were deeply committed. Many of them were deeply committed Christians, and the Christianity and Judeo-Christian values had a massive influence on their thought. And there absolutely was a major difference between the American Revolution and the French Revolution. How do we begin to help people understand that, so they know where America is headed, so we don't head in the way of the French?
That's an excellent question, and I'm an historian, so I'm going to give you an historical answer. We got to pay attention to that history, don't we? Because Locke was profoundly influenced, I would argue, by biblical Christianity. One of the books he wrote before he died was The Reasonableness of Christianity. And what he argues in that book is that there's one basic doctrine that people have to believe if they're going to find peace with God and find salvation, which he thought was the most important thing you could do in life. The most important quest you could be on was the quest for salvation. That's John Locke. And the most important thing you need to believe, he said in that book, is that Jesus is the Messiah. So Locke is not Rousseau. Rousseau is Rousseau, and the anti-Catholic, anti-Christian bigotry that came out of the French Revolution, that certainly wasn't Locke, and it certainly wasn't the American founders. But now I have to offer some appropriate, I think, criticism of some friends on the right. And so you do have a movement within conservatism, Patrick Deneen from Notre Dame and others who have rejected Locke. They've rejected the founders. They don't believe the American experiment at its core is morally legitimate. They think it was steeped in sin from its birth. And what sin are we talking about? Radical individualism and materialism. And I would argue, I think these guys need to do a little more homework. They got to go back to finishing school. They got to do their homework. They got to read the documents of that period much more carefully. And sometimes you get the impression they haven't read them at all, because virtually everything, for example, that Patrick Deneen has said, that I've heard, that I've read from Deneen on John Locke, is absolutely mistaken. It's just mistaken. He seems to have read secondary sources about Locke, but not Locke himself. Deeply Christian ideas are embedded in Locke's political theology. And I did a piece for the New Criterion last year, I think it was, long essay, reviewing the last 50 years of scholarship on John Locke. Not an easy thing to do. The last 50 years of John Locke scholarship, and the overwhelming consensus among the historians and the political philosophers and political scientists is Locke is operating at a more or less a Christian framework. But you would think from the discussion today from some people on the right that Locke was this secular Voltaire Hobbesian guy. I'm like, wake up, man! Get in touch with the scholarship and do your homework and live up to the standards of your profession, your academic profession. That would be a good place to start for some of these guys. I'm being a little unkind, but it does irritate me when we have a discussion that just seems so disconnected from the actual scholarship and where it is. So they've turned Locke, some of these guys on the right, they've turned Locke and the American founders into caricatures. And in an odd sort of way, these guys who would identify as Christian conservatives, they're making the same mistakes on the hard left that the hard left is making. They're converting these guys, the founders, John Locke, into militant secularists, which is simply not true. So as an historian, I want to say, you got to do your homework. You got to face the historical record clearly, intelligently, and soberly. We have problems in this country, no question about it. Radical individualism is rampant. Materialism is rampant. But don't blame Locke and the founders for that, because as it seems to me, the Christian scriptures are pretty clear on this, and so is our own experience. Every political government, every religious society is one generation away from corruption. It has to be transmitted. Those ideas and values have to be transmitted from one to the next. That's been the great failure, not the ideas themselves, but the failure to communicate those ideas, to inculcate them in the next generation. That's the great educational failure, it seems to me, that we're responsible for. Can't blame Locke, can't blame the founders.
So you talk about the criticism of Locke. I want to kind of unpack his philosophy just a little more. Now, in your book, you refer to Locke as a Christian humanist. Now, I know most people, when they think of humanism, they think of it as completely secular and anti-God and radically individualistic. But Desiderius Erasmus, who actually, is one of the individuals that's behind the Greek text that the King James translators use for the King James, and everyone loves the King James, right? He was also a Christian humanist. So explain the humanism of individuals like John Locke and Desiderius Erasmus.
Well, Jacob, thank you for that very intelligent question. I don't know if you get asked to discuss Christian humanism, but it was a major part of my thesis and in my book. So what's Christian humanism? And it really, in many ways, begins with Erasmus of Rotterdam, Catholic thinker, a contemporary of Martin Luther. He and Luther were initially allies because they were deeply concerned about the need to communicate the scriptures to ordinary people, because both of them believed if that happened, there would be transformation in European society. And European society, Catholic at the time, desperately needed a moral and spiritual transformation. Erasmus believed that as much as Luther did. They wound up in different places. At the end of the day, Erasmus remained a Catholic. Luther, of course, launches the Protestant Reformation. But the Christian humanist idea is what Erasmus referred to as the philosophy of Christ. And he didn't mean philosophy as a theoretical system. When we talk about the philosophy of Christ, when Erasmus used that phrase, he wasn't talking in abstract philosophical terms. He was talking about imitating the life and teachings of Jesus. So the Christian humanist scholar in the 16th century, Erasmus and others, what they're trying to do is say, look, we can draw on that earlier classical tradition, the Greek and Roman tradition, the medieval tradition, that's all fine, but it's got to be rooted in Scripture. We've got to return to the Bible, the central teachings of the Bible, and getting it into the hands of ordinary people. That was Erasmus. As stunning as that might sound to some of our Protestant friends, that's the Catholic thinker Erasmus. That got him into trouble with the Catholic Church. So Locke is coming out of that tradition, out of that Erasmian tradition, going back to the Scriptures, rooting your political theology in the Scriptures. So, for example, let's get real practical. When you look at Locke's second treatise on government, and he starts talking about the nature of political societies. Let me read you a few lines from the second treatise. You get an idea of what I mean, Locke's political theology and his Christian humanism. He says, the state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, which obliges everyone, and reason, which is that law, teaches all mankind, who will but consult it, that being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. And here's the key line. For men, being all the workmanship of one omnipotent and infinitely wise maker, capital M, all the servants of one sovereign master, capital M, sent into the world by his order, capital H for his order, and about his business, they are his property, whose workmanship they are made to last during his, not another's, pleasure. Now, when Locke uses that phrase, they are his workmanship. His workmanship. That's a biblical idiom that his audience would have instantly recognized. It's Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10. We are God's workmanship, right? Created in Christ Jesus to do good works. Locke knew his Bible. He knew his audience. He's offering a political theology, a theological basis for equal rights, natural law, natural rights, government by consent. That's Christian humanism at its best. You're drawing on the biblical tradition. You're acknowledging the dignity of human beings made in the image of God, but you're not unaware of or indifferent to the dark side of human nature, right? At the end of the day, you've got to have restraints, particularly on government, but also on individuals. That's why you need to be in communities, in moral communities, religious communities. Locke was all for that. Nothing about unrestrained individualism. You will not find that in Locke. He absolutely knew what individuals could do on their own outside of moral communities, outside of religious communities. So that's a good, healthy Christian humanism. You're drawing on the best that the Western classical tradition has. That Greco-Roman tradition, the medieval, you're drawing on the best of that, but you are also rooting it in a traditional understanding of the truths of the Bible. That's Christian humanism, I think, probably in a nutshell.
And I think so. We today could learn from these Christian humanists. Especially Desiderius Erasmus. I know we're talking about John Locke, but I just kind of want to point this out here.
Yeah,
and
please do.
It's that Erasmus, when he looked at the Latin Vulgate, the translation that was used by the church at the time, he disagreed with some of the ways that it was translated. And so part of Christian humanism was going back to the original source. And so Erasmus wanted to get these Greek texts and actually translate directly from the text. And so, you talk about people stripping, historical characters of their context. You talk about, cherry picking history. I think so many do that today, even with their criticism of Locke and even their criticism of Erasmus. They fail to do what the Christian humanists said, hey, you should probably do in the first place, and that's go to the source. And you did just that when you were quoting Locke in his writings.
Yes, no, Jacob, thank you for that. And I'm a huge fan of Erasmus in many ways. He is an incredibly important figure. You think about it, Luther relied on that translation from Erasmus, that Greek translation, right, of the New Testament. Luther was relying on that for his own work as he moves forward. So they are initially allies. Go back to the original texts and understand the context of those texts. So there's a spirit of, I think what really impresses me about the Christian humanists, unlike many people around them, is they really respect the individual conscience and individual rights, even though they might not always use that phrase, individual rights. So let me read you another line from Erasmus here. He said, "The world is full of rage, hate, and wars. What will the end be if we employ only bulls and the stake? It is no great feat to burn a little man. It is a great achievement to persuade him." Now, remember when he's living. He's living in a time of crusades, of inquisitions, of religious intolerance. And he's saying, enough. You persuade, you use the methods of Jesus. And that's very much, that's in the 16th century. Locke is making the same argument, I think deeply influenced by the Christian humanist himself. He's making the same argument in the 17th century. And Madison and Jefferson and the founders will again make that argument in the 18th century, but they will give it political legs that no one else has given it.
You mentioned earlier that Locke went to the Bible, went to biblical truth as part of his foundation for the political philosophy that he espoused. And our founders, I think, did the same thing. In fact, in the Declaration of Independence, they mentioned that the rights that are given to us, that we're saying that the king is violating. The reason he's violating them because it's not his to give in the first place, so it's not his to take. If God gives man these rights, then no government, no human authority on planet Earth can take these rights away. Now, that did have an effect on the way that Locke viewed atheism. And I think in some ways, and you talk about in his book, or in your book, and in some of your lectures, that Locke was, afraid of atheists being in power. So let's just talk about his moral foundation, how that influenced his political philosophy, but also his views on atheism.
No, that's a great question. Let's take the second question first. Jacob, thank you for that. No one would have been arguing, almost no one, there's maybe one or two exceptions, but almost no one in the 17th century, in Locke's day, is arguing that atheists should have religious liberty. So Locke shares in that perspective, in that outlook, that atheism was a threat to the civil order. And the way he put it was, the absence of God, even in thought only, dissolves all. It dissolves the bonds of friendship, the bonds of loyalty, the idea of making oaths. Now, you can criticize Locke for that and argue that he was being inconsistent, given his argument for religious freedom. That's a debate we can have. Was he being morally inconsistent, philosophically inconsistent, in not defending atheism? You could certainly make that case. But there was just a huge fear. Let me put it another way. There was a shared set of assumptions that if you didn't have citizens of virtue, people of virtue, there's no way you're going to sustain a political society. That was just a given. Now, how do you get people of virtue over the long haul? You have to be connected to religious communities. That was simply the widespread belief in Locke's day, and really up to the American founders as well. There's a couple things we could say about that. Thankfully, this political society, the United States and the West more broadly, has absolutely made room for and guaranteed the rights of atheists, people of absolutely no religious conviction whatsoever, the nuns, right? And they are citizens in our republic. They have equal rights, et cetera, et cetera. Having said that, you couldn't find any of the founders, including Thomas Jefferson or Ben Franklin, probably the most unorthodox, religiously unorthodox of the founders. None of them would have said, "Yeah, we could build a democratic republic on the backs of atheists." No one really believed that. And I think we can have a good, robust debate about, well, what would it look like for a society to ground itself in some doctrinaire or militant way in atheism? What would that political society look like? Well, we don't really have to wonder. We don't have to wonder. We have the 20th century example, which, of course, communism, the Soviet Union, and right now with us still North Korea and China. Those political societies grounded in an atheistic philosophy, they never turn out well. So I think we can absolutely and must guarantee the political rights and civil liberties of our atheist friends. But building a society on the ideology of atheism, that has not turned out well in either the 20th century or the 21st century.
Yeah, and I think there are also, just how Locke influenced even some of what the founders wrote, and kind of just this understanding. I think John Adams, when he wrote to Massachusetts militia, I believe, at the end of the 1790s, he said our Constitution was made for a moral and religious people only, and it's wholly inadequate for any other. So just kind of following in that stream of Lockean thought there.
Yes.
Now, also, I wanted to ask about, towards the beginning of your book, God, Locke, and Liberty, you mentioned that Locke had an understanding of Christian piety, and he said that if it's properly understood, it can lay the foundation for a more just and tolerant society, even tolerating, what we're talking about now, even tolerating atheists. According to Locke, what is this Christian piety? Can you explain that to me?
Yeah. In many ways, and this, again, is largely ignored by Locke's critics on the left and on the right. He starts out his letter on toleration, which I have read many times. You have to read your primary source document many times if it's going to be the subject of your dissertation. So I've read it many times. And it's amazing to me. In fact, I'll tell you a quick story about that, if I could, Jacob. I remember on the night before, I think, my defense of my dissertation, I was meeting with my advisor, wonderful advisor I had, and Ian McBride, and he was from Northern Ireland, wonderful Irish accent, and he said to me, Joe, there are a few people who've read Locke's letter on toleration more than you have, and then he paused. But not many. And that's the encouragement I needed going into the dissertation. So I read it many times. And what always strikes me is that Locke essentially begins the letter on toleration with an argument about the life and teachings of Jesus. The life and teachings of Jesus. And I'll just read you a few lines here. If the gospel and the apostle may be credited, no man can be a Christian without charity, and without that faith which works not by force, but by love. He talks about Jesus as the captain of our salvation, and that Christians should be prepared with the gospel of peace, with the exemplary holiness of their conversation. This was his method, meaning Christ's method. So he looks to the example of Jesus, the life and teachings of Christ in the early church, as he begins his letter concerning toleration, his defense of religious freedom, that he wants to have an effect across denominational lines, have a wide appeal. So that's just worth kind of thinking about and pausing. And I'll pause there for a minute and have you follow up on that. That's where Locke begins his political argument for religious freedom is in the life and teachings of Christ. And that seems so obvious to us now that, sure, Jesus didn't coerce anybody into his church, into Christianity. He didn't coerce anybody. So why would we want to coerce people? But Jacob, this is the astonishing thing when you get into the time period, the context. It is taken for granted in Locke's day, right through the 17th century, that somehow the teachings of the Bible support religious persecution, support coercion, support a uniform church imposed upon an unwilling population through the political arm of the state. It is assumed that the Bible supports that outlook. And Locke is saying, no, it doesn't. The life and teachings of Jesus do not. And that's part of the thread of his argument in the letter concerning toleration.
And once again, just going back to what we talked about earlier, the Christian humanists and their encouragement to people just to go back to the original source. And I think the problem with what you're talking about there, saying that Scripture supports coercing people into the faith. Well, the problem with that is you're taking a framework that you've built outside of Scripture, and then you're going to Scripture and you're forcing it upon the text. And I'm pretty sure, if you go to like a theology school, they'll teach you that's eisegesis. What you really need to be practicing is good exegesis, where you go to the text first.
Yes.
Just like the Christian humanists did, and then build a framework afterwards.
Yes, and I'll just say this, Jacob. One of the kind of the tragedies, you could argue, of how Christianity developed through the Middle Ages, even though we had brilliant thinkers like Augustine and Aquinas, even those men could not contemplate a society, a political society that was characterized by religious pluralism and religious freedom. They couldn't really imagine it. And so you had, for example, Augustine himself invoking the Scripture, the passage there when Jesus talks about the kingdom of heaven and the banquet, and bringing people in, pulling them in from the streets and the fields, compel them to come into the feast. And that verse was interpreted for centuries by the leaders in the church as an argument for coercion. Compel them to come in. We will compel them to come into the established church. And there were literally treatises written defending that doctrine, but then also treatises written against it and going after that interpretation of Scripture. Locke doesn't get into scriptural debates in a letter concerning toleration. He doesn't want to get wrapped up in arguing Bible verses. He just argues more broadly from the life and teachings of Christ and the thrust of it. And then he goes into natural law and natural rights arguments in that letter on toleration, which I think is part of the reason it's so appealing and has such an enduring power.
Well, and I highly encourage the audience just to check out the book God, Locke, and Liberty, and this conversation about that book has just been amazing. I wanted to also get into your book, the other book you wrote that I actually mentioned first, A Hobbit, A Wardrobe in a Great War, where you talk about two other great historical figures too, that just like Locke I admire so much, J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. And we talked about the end there about Locke's view of Christian piety, just kind of Christians engaging in the public sphere, and I think Tolkien and Lewis both did that in a beautiful way through their authorship. In writing these books, they served in the military, they served in World War I, and they wrote these amazing books that came out of that. So let's talk about that book. Over C.S. Lewis, their friendship, and just the lessons they learned during World War I. What led you to write that book?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Jacob. And let me make a little connective tissue maybe between Locke and C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, a little connective tissue. It's worth mentioning that, here are J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. They live in England in the 20th century. England is a parliamentary democracy. It's a liberal democratic state. It is a Lockean state. So they are beneficiaries, you could argue, of that Lockean liberal tradition where there's religious freedom. Tolkien is a Catholic. Lewis is an Anglican. They are scholars, respected scholars at Oxford University. They are both allowed to be at Oxford and worship in their own way according to the dictates of conscience. So they are beneficiaries of that religious pluralism and that commitment to natural rights and political equality. Just kind of some connective tissue. They're there in an amazingly liberal democratic place in the world in the 20th century. That context, that academic freedom that they had necessarily exist, and even to this day doesn't necessarily exist in as many places as we'd like, right? And we're having trouble right here at home in the American Academy for academic freedom. That's another story. But let me try to answer your question briefly about, what drew me as a Locke scholar to get involved in a book on J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. And I think it was a couple of things. I didn't start reading The Lord of the Rings until I was actually doing my work on John Locke. Here's some more connective tissue for you. I was studying, working on my John Locke dissertation, and after the movies came out, the Lord of the Rings movies came out, I decided I needed to read The Lord of the Rings for the first time, and I did while I was working on Locke during the day, and then I'm reading Tolkien at night in an English pub, which is the best way to do it. And I just fell in love with the story. And how morally invigorated I felt being drawn into this story, this epic story about the struggle between good and evil and how the choices of every individual, no matter how small, the smallest hobbit, has a role to play in fighting against evil. That's a tremendously compelling story. That gets me interested in Tolkien. I'd always been a big fan of C.S. Lewis since my earliest days as a Christian. I didn't know the two of them had a friendship. I discovered that fact. I didn't know that both of them had fought in the First World War. When I discovered that fact, then the lights start to go off in my little head. And I think to myself, wait a minute. Tolkien and Lewis both fought in the First World War. They became friends at Oxford in the 1920s. And then they both go on to write these epic stories of a struggle between good and evil. And if you think about it, the Lord of the Rings and the Chronicles of Narnia, these are kind of war stories. They're war stories. So you start to ask yourself, well, how might the experience of combat in the industrialized slaughter of the First World War, how might that have influenced their literary imagination? And that led me to write the first book, A Hobbit, a Wardrobe, and a Great War. And I'm happy to announce on your program that I have signed a contract with HarperCollins to write a sequel to that book that will now take the readers through the post-World War I right through the Second World War with these two men and their friendship. And I'm calling that book War, Friendship, and Imagination. War, Friendship, and Imagination. And we're going to look at their lives right through the Second World War, because that's when they're writing, if you think about it, that's when they're writing the works that we know them for. Tolkien's writing The Lord of the Rings right through the Second World War. Lewis writes The Abolition of Man, the Space Trilogy, the Screw Tape Letters. He's doing the radio broadcasts that become a Mere Christianity. That's all through the Second World War. So that's really where the action is. And I didn't quite appreciate that when I did my first book on World War I. World War II is where the action is, and that's where this next book is going to really focus in on. So stay tuned for that for next year. We'll come back maybe on the show, talk about it.
Absolutely. War, Friendship, and Imagination. You heard it here.
Yes.
I'm super excited about that book. And I'm really, we start off talking about Locke, and now we're talking about Lewis and Tolkien. Well, how did we get here? Well, what I think is interesting is the fact that just like Locke, the circumstances that he grew up with,
Yes.
just the tumultuous scene and setting
Yes.
in Europe during the 17th century for Locke, which influenced his political philosophy and his political
Yes.
writings.
Yes.
A very similar tumultuous scene happened with Lewis and Tolkien. That
Yes.
unrest, the wars, is really what
Yes.
set them up to become
Yes.
such great literary writers.
Yes, that's exactly right, Jacob. And let me underscore that point. There's no one alive now who fought in the First World War and then lived through the Second World War. So their lives were bracketed by global conflicts, completely upended by global conflicts. And quite often in that kind of a crisis, amazing things come out of that in an artistic sense, in a political sense, in a philosophical sense. People start thinking big thoughts. There's a sense of urgency in the air, because I think we as Americans don't quite appreciate this. When Germany invades Poland in 1939 in September, now Great Britain is at war again for the second time with Germany, and it's completely unprepared. And it's not going to be long before the Nazi war machine overwhelms continental Europe. One nation state after another falls into Nazi hands. Every port, every major capital is going to be controlled by the Nazis, by early 1941. And the United States is on the sidelines, where in an isolationist mood, Great Britain is hanging by a thread, by an existential thread. And the only thing that really stands in the way between Hitler and the conquest of Great Britain, the Nazi conquest, it's the English Channel and it's Winston Churchill that stand between the end of Great Britain and the end of freedom in Britain. And that's when Tolkien and Lewis are living. They're living in that time period. And they're having to watch this all happening in it from 1939 right through 1945, and that creates a sense of urgency. And what is so amazing and impressive to me, and I think would be really encouraging to your audience, is to think about what they did during those crisis years. They're too old to serve in the military, but they served their country in a whole host of ways. They're part of the Home Guard. They are taking in refugees, children refugees in their homes who are being sent out of London and other dangerous places, and that's involving a good deal of their own time. Lewis will tutor and mentor a lot of these young evacuees. And, of course, they're getting on with their academic careers. They're teaching. They're their students. They are mentoring their students. They are doing research. This is their paid work. Their paid work is to be Oxford professors, right? Academic work. So when are they actually writing the great epic works that we know and love them for? When is Tolkien writing The Lord of the Rings? When is Lewis actually writing the space trilogy? Well, guess what? They're doing that on their own time. They're doing that in the evenings, maybe on the weekends. They're stealing time away from other things to write this amazing, creative, imaginative, inspiring literature because they have to. That's what it is to be that kind of a writer. They have to. They can't not do that. They have a poet's heart. They're literary men, and they're not getting paid to do any of that. They have to. And that ought to be, if that's not encouraging to us, that they could do that in the crisis of war, of a second world war, if that doesn't encourage us to get off the couch, then nothing will. Right?
Yeah, and that last point you made, just looking to these men for encouragement, and we should be encouraged because of the fact,
Yes.
you talk about the tumultuous nature of and the setting there in Europe. You talk about the wars. You talk
Yes.
about the hardships. These men, they experienced it firsthand. They lived
Yes.
in it. They lived with the results of war. They lived with the cost of war. They lived with the
Yes.
memory of war. And yet so many times I think today,
Yes.
living in 2023, we look back and we
Yes.
have this nostalgia for the past, and we think, man,
Yeah.
if only life were like this, if only we had these
Yes.
men here today, if only, circumstances around the globe and in our own nation were better, maybe I
Yes.
could be a better leader.
Yes.
Maybe God would raise up men today to do, the works of Locke and of Tolkien
Yes.
and of Lewis. But
Yes.
as we've talked about in this show, they weren't great men because the world around them was so great. They're
That's
great
correct.
men because the world around them was challenging them.
That's exactly
And
right.
they
That's
stepped
exactly
up to the
right.
challenge.
That's exactly right, Jacob. You put it very, very well. The crucible, the furnace of two world wars, particularly the Second World War, produced out of them, and they didn't do it in isolation. This is another great lesson for us. It's the friendship between Tolkien and Lewis and the way they encourage each other in their writing, and of course, a larger circle of Christian friends known as the Inklings, these Christian scholars and authors who met together every week. They met at the Eagle and Child pub on, I think, Tuesday mornings. They met in Lewis's rooms at Magdalen College on Thursday or Fridays. They met every week for years. They met every week without fail through the Second World War to share their works, what they were working on, what they were writing. Let me read you a few lines, if I could, from a letter that C.S. Lewis wrote to his good friend Owen Barfield. Barfield was one of the original members of the Inklings, and a scholar and an author. He's writing to Barfield in 1938 in September, and it's just before we're really off to the races. The war has begun. It has not begun. It's 1938, so it's just before the invasion of Poland. But there's real sense of crisis, the Munich crisis in particular, when Hitler absorbs a portion of Czechoslovakia for the promise of peace. That's what's going on in September of 1938, the Munich crisis. So Lewis is writing to Barfield, and this is what he says: "I have a lot more to say on this topic when we meet. That is, if we meet. For, of course, our whole joint world may be blown up before the end of the week. I can't feel in my bones that it will, but my bones know damn all about it. If we are separated, God bless you, and thanks for 100 good things I owe to you, more than I can count or weigh. In some ways, we've had a corking time these 20 years. What a great British expression, a corking time. They've known each other over 20 years. They met when they were undergraduates, and here they are 20 years later, and Britain's on the edge of war again. And you feel the sort of the poignancy and the heartbreak and the sense of the uncertainty and yet the friendship, right? They're going to carry on as best they can, but they're in crisis mode. And I think we just completely forget that as Americans, right? The need to stand up, to do the right thing, to honor our callings before God, before Christ, if I can invoke the name of the Lord, my Lord, to be faithful to our callings in the midst of the crisis. It's a deeply encouraging story of Tolkien and Lewis and their friendship. I'm trying to work on a film series, I should say, based on this, or a documentary film, some kind of a film project with the same title of my book, A Hobbit, a Wardrobe, and a Great War, I've had I have to say, I'll just say this: I had a falling out with the production company I was originally involved in, and they're off doing some other things. That has been a difficult time, but I am trying to move forward with this project. It is a deeply encouraging story, the lives of these two men bracketed by global conflict.
And God will bless the work you've done. You've wrote just beautiful books, and you speak about this topic so well. And I know, he has a plan to continue to use the knowledge he's blessed you with to share about the lives of these great men. So thank you so much for joining me here on the podcast today. We're right here at the end, but how can people connect with you and the work you are doing?
Oh, terrific, Jacob. Thank you for asking me for that. A couple of ways. They can go to my website, josephloconte.com, www.josephloconte.com, or there should be an email, joe@josephloconte.com, LOCONTE.com, joe@josephloconte.com. Happy to hear from your audience there. Go look at my website. I've got my various essays posted up there. And I so appreciate the time. It's been a great privilege being with you, Jacob. I really appreciate how well you've prepared for this interview. It's lovely when interviewers actually have read one of my books. That's always fun.
Absolutely.
So thanks for that.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the podcast at Real Jacob Kersey on the socials. If you want to connect with us there, we'll see you back next week.